Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Russia Question, a book talk series devoted to all things Russia. This is possible with the generous support from the Orthodox Christian Studies Center, and I'm grateful to George Demokopoulos, Aristotle, Papa Nicolau, Catherine Mendelakis, Siobhan Larlesa, and Nathaniel Wood for the help in organizing it. I'm your host for the Russia Question, Michael Ossorgin. And we are so excited. I've been very excited for a very long time to discuss this work with all of its contributors, and especially its three editors, Caryl Emerson, Randall Poole, and George Pattison. They'll be discussing the Oxford Handbook of Russian Religious Thought with us today. A quick word about each of them, and we could go on and on, but I want you to have a sort of access point to each of their work. So Caryl Emerson is the A. Watson Armour the third university professor emeritus of Slavic languages and literatures at Princeton University. Her work is focused on the Russian classics, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Mikhail Bakhtin, and Russian music, opera, and theater. Recent projects include the Russian modernist Sigismund Khrzhizhanovsky, excuse the stumbling, the allegorical historical novelist Vladimir Sharov, whom, if you take my Apocalypse course, we also read this coming spring, and the co-editing with George Pattison and Randall Poole here of the Oxford Handbook. Randall Poole is a professor of intellectual history at the College of St. Scholastica and a fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He's the translator and editor of Problems of Idealism, Essays in Russian Social Philosophy, published in 2003, and the co-editor of 5 other volumes, A History of Russian Philosophy, 1830 to 1930, Faith, Reason, and the Defense of Human Dignity, 2010 and 2013 were released, Religious Freedom in Modern Russia, 2018, and the Oxford Handbook of Russian Religious Thought before us today. He also wrote Evgeny Trubetskoy, Icon in Philosophy 2021, and Law and the Christian Tradition in Modern Russia, which is slated for 2022, and we'll have him over to discuss that with Paul Valliere in the spring. He's also the author of many articles and book chapters on Russian intellectual history, philosophy, and religion. And George Pattison is a retired Anglican priest and scholar. His primary research areas has been post-Hegelian philosophy of religion, with emphasis on Kierkegaard, Russian religious thought, Heidegger, and visual art. He has recently completed a 3-part philosophy of Christian life, listed by OUP 2018, 2019, and 2021. So welcome to each of you. It's really my pleasure to be discussing this fantastic collection with you, and you can see that it's been used and traveled with me over the past year and given me so much to think about. I'm deeply grateful for you putting this all together, and welcome. I would like to begin perhaps with, let's see, Randall Poole. If you would sort of let us know a little bit about the background of this project and how it all came together, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for organizing this webinar dedicated to the Oxford Handbook. It's a wonderful opportunity. So I believe that the initial idea, the initiative for the Oxford Handbook came from George Pattison. He had served as editor of previous Oxford handbooks. They were received with great acclaim. He's had a long-standing interest in the history of Russian religious thought, primarily through Dostoevsky and Berdiaev. Again, if my understanding is correct, George asked Caryl to co-edit the volume with him, and then Caryl asked me, and that was the team. It's been one of the highlights of my career to have been involved with my two esteemed co-editors and an international team of wonderful scholars. Reflecting on the handbook this morning, I can't really imagine how it could have gone better or how the results could be better. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss it with my co-editors. The three of us commissioned, as I said, an international team of scholars. Working with them was virtually problem-free and was a real delight, and we've been very gratified at the response that the handbook has had in the year since its publication.
Wonderful, thank you. And George or Caryl, is there anything that you might add to that, or has he covered it?
Yes, I would like to correct Randall on several points. First of all, what's interesting about the handbook,
like a great editor that you are.
Right. What's interesting about the handbook is that the three of us found each other on account of mutual lacks. What happened was George turned up at Princeton and said, I've been asked to do this thing. I love Russian religious thought, but I'm not a Slavist. And I was awfully interested because my first trip to Russia was in 1956 at the age of 13. And I fell in love with the country then. It had everything that America didn't have. Namely, it had a certain amount of poverty of consumption patterns, a huge amount of suffering, self-awareness, the worst government in the world, and the best music and the best novels and philosophy in the world. So America must have been doing something not so right, and Russia must be doing something wrong. Of course, I was 13, didn't know anything, but I figured this was a country worth learning about, began in music, moved to history, then to literature, and I realized when George turned up in my office in Princeton that one of the things in the last 10, 15 years that connected all those fields of Russian culture was, in fact, Russian religious thought. And that doesn't quite qualify me to be an editor because I'm a literary humanist, and therefore I turned to Randall. And Randall, one of this country's best intellectual historians in Russian philosophy, very graciously agreed to join us. So what we have is a person with theological training, with literary humanities emphasis, and then intellectual historian. Couldn't have been a better team.
That's sort of, that could be a segue into discussing Bakhtin's Russian religious philosophy as far as fulfilling mutual lacks that each of us possesses, right? But we'll postpone that for a moment. And George, I'll turn to you, and you can add to your sort of conceptualization of the project. And I might just throw in a question about the title of the book while we're at it, which you address in your introduction. But you know, as you discuss, this is summarizing. There are three central components to the field. They overlap with various scholastic fields, although they're far from completely. It's national character insofar as it is Russian, spiritual theological religiosity, therefore religious, and its philosophical conceptual ideological bent or thought. On the one hand, it speaks to the uniqueness of Russian philosophical undertaking, and then again, it can be used as a criticism. And I'm wondering if you might sort of say a word about that, a word about the project, and perhaps a word about the Metropolitan Larian's forward to the project and why that's there, please. Whoops, you're muted. I gave you a lot, I admit. Choose. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry about that.
There we are.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Randall about the pleasure, and I'd say the intellectual excitement of being involved in this project, and everything really did go swimmingly. He mentioned other handbooks I've been involved with, and I can say one of them went to the edge of a legal dispute that might have held up the publication for 10 years and got OUP into serious debt. But we had, even though this is a Russian religious handbook, no scandal scenes, nothing like that. Everything went
You have to
all
do it
managed
again.
to work very well, and we had a very good live meeting in Glasgow with quite a number of the contributors. So, and I learned so much from it, and from both Randall and Caryl in particular during it. Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned in your notes to us that this could be read as in a critical way Russian religious thought. I didn't quite get that because it doesn't come across as anything negative to me. I mean, there are, in theology and religious studies today, there's a lot of questions about the concept religion and whether it's really a viable concept, whether it doesn't kind of cover too many things that are not just dissimilar, as every field does, but maybe even essentially dissimilar, that kind of get lumped together. But I think certainly in the context of a work like this, where religion has the qualifiers Russian and thought, this does at least give a fuzzy picture of what we're covering. And it is, I think, something distinct from Orthodox thought, because clearly there's many people who are represented, as it were, in the handbook. Let's say someone like the filmmaker Tarkovsky, for whom, of course, orthodoxy is a huge part of the background, without which it wouldn't be what it was. But then again, it's not exactly orthodox, at least not in terms of dogmatic correctness. So, and again, I think purely from the publisher's point of view, there's quite a lot of handbooks and introductions now to orthodoxy in general, Russian Orthodox theology, particular aspects of Orthodox theology, like Orthodox Trinitarian teaching. So in a sense, that is being done elsewhere, and I'm not a great fan of duplication. Sometimes in the academy we go around duplicating what each other are doing, and maybe there isn't. We shouldn't do that so much. Nevertheless, of course, orthodoxy is as I said about Tarkovsky, it's part of the context, part of the background. You just can't do without it. And we certainly wanted a Russian Orthodox, a strong Russian Orthodox voice in the volume. And when I initially approached Hilarion, it was as a contributor. Of course, he's a very busy man. And so what he said in the end was that if he disagreed with the contents of the volume, he would write a response. But if he largely agreed, then he would write a foreword. So as you know, he wrote a foreword. So in a sense, one can take that as one will, but that's how that came about.
Wonderful. I'm glad that the term didn't strike you as critical. I think I was in the back of the mind. I mentioned in my notes to you guys what Barth's criticism, for example, right, which Paul Valier writes about in this handbook. He says the peculiarly unrestrained manner of thought and speech characteristic of the Russian theologians and philosophers of religion leads them to obliterate every boundary between philosophy and theology, reason and revelation, scripture, tradition, and immediate illumination, spirit and nature, pistis and gnosis, as well as the distinction between the economic and the human and Trinity. So, I suppose even looking at that, you could treat that as well. Congratulations, they've managed to do it all and not just a criticism, right? But it is interesting to think about the sort of Orthodox structure behind so much of the creative pursuits in Russia, especially of the 19th and 20th centuries, and to see sort of how they took root in the cultural world outside of, the strict limits of the church. And that leads us to maybe part 4 is it's a good segue to part 4, and the sort of logos-centric forms of expression that are so abundant in the Russian religious thought tradition, right? Whether it be music or poetry or film. And Caryl, I was hoping that you could walk us through that section and say a bit about it, please.
I'd be glad to do that. It's a strange business, words in Russian culture. Everybody who knows a little bit about Russia knows that there's a certain poetry worship. That is, poets are prophets, poets co-create. The word is the thing that brings a thing into existence. These are all controversies we discuss in the handbook. And it makes a poet like, say, Mandelstam take the Emia Slavia controversy seriously, write a poem about it. This is pretty unusual, I think, in the beginning of the 20th century to have major poets write on both sides of the divide, not necessarily theological poetry. You have it in Olga Sedakova today. You have poetry that is infused with a sort of co-creation. That is, if there is a divine principle, we're not guilty in front of it. We work together with it in order to realize ourselves. So there's not as much sort of heavy guilt and heavy repentance as much as there is co-glorification. It's a marvelous aspect of Russian Orthodoxy, which separates it from both certain Roman and certain Protestant strains. But here I think the word's peculiar. And if you look at the entry in the handbook on poetry by Martha Kelly, she has a whole section there on silence, because the poets themselves, since they are so fully involved in what the word can do, they actually acknowledge that the word can't do a lot of things. And that's an important role. Tyutchev, Mandelstam, they all talk about the word as being valuable as a sort of pre-liturgical or pre-word reality, a pre-rational cosmic plenitude. That is, you use the word to talk about things that words can't do. And then this opens us up to the other entries that we invited in the handbook. It was both music, Rebecca Mitchell and Clement Antonov is on the icon. These are wonderful essays which show you where music and visual art went that words admitted they couldn't do, having done so much else in Russian culture. With music, another very peculiar matter, because the Russians came to validate music in a way that would seem to undo it. For instance, music was supposed to transcend linear time. It's fine to say music doesn't do space, doesn't do things, but time is what music, in fact, has to be realized in. So they had an idea of music that was actually bigger than performed or perceived music, and that somehow Russian music was going to save modernity from itself. And somehow the end of the world was going to come through on Russian soil. A Russian Orpheus was going to trigger it. And this was actually a development in Russian philosophy and Russian music that wasn't really coordinated with itself. Great Russian religious thinkers like Bulgakov and Losev didn't like Scriabin, thought he was crazy, egotistical, black, magical. So you didn't necessarily have people who used philosophy, understanding philosophy in ways that musicians and creators would reinforce. Now with the icon, of course, it's a marvelous tradition. And you had it with fully secular painters in the 19th century who used bits of Russian religious art as subject matter. But what you had in the avant-garde, of course, was an entire internalization of the icon. That is, you look at our role as observers outside a piece of visual art as something you reconceive in light of the fact that icons don't just stand there and get looked at, they look back at you. In other words, they're animated items, and they are therefore spiritual items. The eyes are windows, they're not just painted on. And if you begin thinking about the work you do, obviously you get important filmmakers and important visual artists who integrate religion in such a way that makes it almost indistinguishable from integrating the human being. And that's something that Russia's always been wonderfully able to do. And it's also, just to get back to what both George and Randall have said, it's what's made so many other professional philosophers look at Russian philosophy as philosophizing. That is what they don't do. Philosophy, they philosophize, which means that they bring all the exciting and seductive parts of culture in and claim it as their own creative field. I'll just say one more thing, and that's what's missing. Randall said nothing was missing, nothing could be better. And I've come to think that in part 4, it would have been wonderful to have something on Russian theater. We didn't think about it, but the reason theater is so important is there have been major rethinkings now. I think of especially Vera Shestsova in London, rethinking of someone that we think of as a sort of 20th century standard even almost Soviet theatrical person, Stanislavski, a person who created a sort of actor's reality that was then borrowed and secularized further by Hollywood. Stanislavski had a religious vocabulary that was entirely obscured in translations when he said dushevny, duhovny, spiritual, translated as mental. I mean, this is impossible. If you go back and relook at Stanislavski, you see that he is imbued with Russian religious reality, not just thought, but Russian religious reality in such a way that entirely interprets anew what he's trying to do with the actor. And the actor, of course, is a type of second soul for any role that one would like to reenact liturgically. Theater is a type of liturgy. So I wished we had done something on theater, and that was not our fault. That work's just happening now. But should we do a volume, we would be able to include theater with our other fine arts.
I would look forward to that, and I would also say that the opposite is equally true, right? The liturgy is a form of theater, right? I mean, it's a dramatic reenactment of the liturgical calendar, the sacraments, to hold memory in place, right? And that seems like a very natural fit. I mean, I would only add to that it seems like the icons. Well, Stanislavski is sort of fulfilling the role of imitating another life to perfection, right? I mean, his means for imitating is to embody another way of seeing things, another being almost, right, through his artistic method. And that is the function, in a sense, of one of the functions of the icon, is to have a model that is generated that you follow, and embody and work to become, right? So I could see exactly how that would be a fascinating study, and that there are several ways in. And I want to pause for a quick moment to say that at any point, if a question comes up in the audience, please write it in the Q&A, and I will work to incorporate it after we've had a bit more discussion. So it's available, it's there. Start formulating your questions. If you have them already, please put them up. And now I want to turn to Randall to ask you about, speaking of Bulgakov, whom you mentioned, one of the philosophers, Caryl, that you mentioned, who sort of had a distaste for Scriabin's demonic music. He was very interesting in other ways, and one of them was his espousal of a kind of Christian humanism or personalism. And there are several Christian humanists or personalists. Obviously, you're more qualified to make the distinction than I am, but Randall, would you please tell us a bit about those figures in Russian religious thought?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Michael. Well, you mentioned Bulgakov, so I can start with him. In one of his lectures delivered in the United States in 1934, the lecture was called "Social Teaching in Modern Russian Orthodox Theology." Bulgakov used the very term Christian humanism to describe not only his own theology, but the main current in modern Russian theology as a whole. At the beginning of our webinar today, you referred to Karl Barth and his hostility toward Russian religious thought, and I think that perhaps the main reason for that hostility is that after the Great War, Barth became sharply critical of the humanist tradition within Christianity. So it's not surprising that, given the prominence of the Christian humanist tradition within Russian religious thought, that Barth was sharply critical of that tradition. So I don't want to reduce Russian religious thought as a whole to Christian humanism, but I think there's little question that Christian humanism is a main current within Russian religious thought, and it's one of the main themes in the Oxford Handbook of Russian Religious Thought. It's closely related to personalism, to the personalist tradition within Russian philosophy. I would even identify personalism as the core of Russian Christian humanism. And in recent years, the richness and depth of personalism within Russian philosophy is receiving a great deal of attention. Evidence of that can be seen in the very recent posthumous publication of a 1,000-page book by the Russian religious scholar, he just recently passed away, Sergei Polovinkin, called Ruski Personalism, and as I mentioned, it's a 1,000-page tome. What do the Russian personalists offer us? I suppose at the most general level, they offer us a very deep understanding of what it is to be human and what it is to be a person, and that is something that should interest all of us. I would suggest that that the distinctiveness of the Russian personalist and Christian humanist tradition consists in the metaphysical implications which they understood in the qualities of being human, in the qualities of being a person. As I mentioned, personalism was the heart of the Christian humanist tradition in Russia. And together, Christian humanism and personalism in Russia offer us an elaborate, intricate, extremely powerful defense of the idea that theism is by far our most compelling worldview. Let's think about that for a moment. What's always attracted me, fascinated me about the Russian religious philosophical tradition is that Russian religious thinkers didn't take theism for granted. They offered one of our most compelling rational intellectual defenses of theism. In large part, this was because of the structural situation of Russian intellectual history. The alignment of church and state led to a reaction in Russian educated society so that atheism was a prominent current in progressive thought in Russia, beginning with the 1860s. Russian religious philosophers therefore had to respond in intellectual earnest to what was probably the most important and popular worldview within the Russian educated public, namely atheism. And they met that challenge in a way that continues to resonate in our own day, and I think in generations to come. So in short, they offered, Russian religious thinkers, they offered a rational, intellectually sophisticated and compelling defense of theism. One of the foundations of that defense was humanist. They began with philosophical anthropology, with human nature, with what it means to be a person, and from those humanist grounds argued up to the divine. So in looking within, in trying to understand what it is to be human, we can ascend to a broader conception of reality, a theistic conception of reality. That approach is summed up very well in one of the great works of the tradition by Simeon Frank, Reality in Man. The subtitle of that book, The Metaphysics of human nature. And that book, published posthumously, I think in 1950, encapsulates the whole preceding tradition. So I would suggest that there are two principal ideas in Christian humanism. First, the idea that human beings are capable of making progress toward salvation, conceived as union with the divine. Salvation isn't merely an act of grace. It's something that human beings can work toward from using their own resources. The second idea of Christian humanism, I think more foundational, is that just as I said, that human nature and that personhood themselves offer compelling grounds for theism. So what, in brief, was that conception of human nature? I suggested in my chapter on Russian religious idealism that it was a broadly and basically idealist conception of human nature, that human beings are capable of recognizing or positing ideals, absolute ideals, the three great transcendentals, truth, good, and beauty, and that they can determine their will, self-determination, according to those ideals. That capacity, ideal self-determination, as Sergei Trubetskoy referred to it, cannot be explained naturalistically. Therefore, it implies, perhaps more strongly, entails metaphysical, theistic conclusions. That conception of human nature, that broadly idealist conception of human nature, was Kantian, but it was also biblical and patristic, and many chapters in the Oxford Handbook go into detail on those very deep roots, biblical, patristic, and modern philosophical roots of the Russian idealist conception of human nature. That conception was first advanced by Boris Chicherin and Vladimir Solovyov, and then embraced by all of the other major Russian idealists and religious philosophers. And we have a whole series of dazzling chapters in the Oxford Handbook devoted to them. The Catherine Yevtukhov on Vladimir Solovyov, Regula Zwolin on Bulgakov, Anna Silajak on Beredyaev, Philip Bubayer on Simeon Frank, just to name a few of them. All of these religious thinkers advanced this powerful, what might be called anthropological or personological defense of theism. It was one of the deep currents in Russian philosophical thought. The tradition of Russian Christian humanism is a tradition that situates Russian religious thought squarely within the European tradition. The humanism of the Renaissance was a religious humanism. Vladimir Solovyov's first biographer, Ernst Radloff, in fact, compared Solovyov to the great Italian Renaissance thinker, Pico della Mirandola. Of course, after the Renaissance, well-known part of Western European intellectual history, that the religious humanism of the Renaissance morphed into an irreligious humanism, even an atheism. Whereas in Russia, the religious humanist tradition of the Renaissance continued and was deepened. In some respects, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the European tradition of religious humanism culminated in the Christian humanist tradition within Russia. And I'll conclude with those words.
Wonderful. Yes. And I would I guess make a connection to well, the Russian religious thought's engagement with the West as being a kind of complicated one. It's something that we had discussed prior to this, and it seems like George, I would like to turn the question to you first. Your article on Berdyaev and existentialism is an example of the kind of dialogue that is possible between the West and Russian religious thought. I'm wondering, to your minds, and please feel free to jump in, other guests, which Western thinkers are given more than short shrifts and might be actually revered, rather than just sort of dismissed or built up as straw men and then dismissed as inferior to Russian religious thought. Yes, would you say a bit about both, please, George? Unmute.
Sorry, yes, I did it again, but I'm now unmuted.
No problem.
Yeah, it's a complex question. Perhaps I could say a little bit about my own path to Russian religious thought,
Please.
Which in a sense would be a kind of autobiographical affirmation of everything that Randall's just said.
Wonderful.
Great way. So, I mean, I started to engage in a formal sense, or not really a formal sense, but a serious sense, at least, with what we're calling Russian religious thought during my theological studies in the 1970s. Now, I'd come to that, as a teenager. I'd read Tolstoy, all of course in English, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and Resurrection, which had a big impact on me. A little bit later in my early 20s, Dostoevsky, so one was aware of that, and of course aware also of other aspects of Russian culture, Eisenstein, music, and other things. But I suppose when I was a theological student in the mid-70s, pursuing a fairly straight, standard Western theological agenda in the context of Edinburgh University, with strong Reformed tradition, of course. I think for our students, at least, Russian religious thought was present primarily in three ways, or at least for me. There was the way of a pilgrim, suddenly became very popular, and even people who didn't read it, the Jesus Prayer suddenly became a kind of regular part of Western religious practice as well. And then Lossky's Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, which I suspect was the book that kind of for most English-speaking theologians alerted to them to the fact that not only was there this other interesting tradition, but also that it was a tradition that had a lot to offer to them. And then for me, Berdyaev. Also, I occasionally read articles in Sabornost, which is the journal of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius, which is the main kind of organ for Anglican Orthodox dialogue. And we had the good fortune to have a retreat conducted by someone called Donald Orchin, who was a leading member of the fellowship at that time and very involved in Anglo-Orthodox dialogue. Also, I had the opportunity to hear Metropolitan Anthony Bloom preaching, which gave a kind of real life instantiation, as it were, of a certain kind of intellectual passion, as it were, that was very alive in his kind of spirituality that wasn't always alive in the English bishops one heard at the time. But anyway, coming back to my theological studies, and in a sense this gets both to your question and picks up Randall's themes. The course of study at Edinburgh at that time was in a sense very divided. There were two wings. Basically, there was the Barthian wing. One of our senior professors, Tom Torrance, had been a student of Barth's, but also someone with strong interest in patristics. So there was definitely a Barthian stream on the one side. And then on the other hand, there was the more existential stream of people who are reading people like Bultmann and Tillich. And I was, as it were, we all had to do a bit of both, certainly. And I was very much impressed by Torrance as an intellectual presence, much more drawn towards the existential side of this. And of course, the objection that the Barthians always made, or one of the objections that the Barthians always made to existentialism, was that it was simply much too anthropocentric. with people like Bultmann and Tillich, you never got round to talking about God because you were all too busy talking about human psychological states, about anxiety and despair and hope and feeling and all those other things, whereas the Bakhtians would say theology has to be about God. And I never accepted that analysis in its entirety. You can see a picture of Kierkegaard on the wall behind me, who of course would be the butt of many of these accusations. But I think, and certainly with retrospect, I wouldn't have put it quite like this at the time, but I think what I felt I was seeing in Russian religious thought was in someone like Berdyaev, but also of course in Dostoevsky, was precisely this route towards God through the human person. And particularly in the case of Dostoevsky, this was done with, if you like, a degree of concreteness, a sensitivity to the complexities and the ambiguities of the human person and of human relationships. That was certainly in my experience up till then unsurpassed, I think. And of course, much more so than, I would say, much as I love Kierkegaard, in a sense, more so than much in Kierkegaard. And Berdyaev, I think, gave a very bold, if you like, affirmation of this and of this principle of personalism, that you can't, as he would put it in more technical language, you can't separate theogony from anthropogony, that our becoming fully human is part of God's becoming fully God, and can't become fully God unless we become fully human. And that whereas for the kind of Bakhtin argument, which is a sort of mirror version of Sartrean atheism, I think, either all creativity is on the side of God and we're merely passive, whereas Berdyaev, saying the meaning of the creative act, turns that round and says, well, if we're made in the image of God, one of the things God is creative. So we have to be creative too. That's what that means. And I think I found that very impressive. But a further dimension, I think, which was largely lacking or weak, let's say weak, in Western theological existentialism was the kind of cosmic dimension. Maybe I would say that the existentialists did get through the individual to God, but somehow this was very much, in a sense, the classic Lutheran scenario of man before God, kind of one-on-one confrontation. Let's sort this out, God, you and me, or under four eyes, as a wonderful Danish expression has it. And certainly the writers I was encountering in the Russian religious tradition, starting with Dostoevsky, I mean, nature, the world, the physical universe was very much part of it. I mean, so much of Dostoevsky is set in urban contexts, inside rooms of various kinds, but then at crucial moments, people go out and they look out onto the steppe, or they go out into the garden, or they just see a tree, or they hear a bird singing. That the cosmos is also constantly present, I think. And interestingly, as I mentioned, one of the Western thinkers I was very interested in at that time, have been ever since, in a way, was Paul Tillich. And I only discovered long afterwards that, this is coming around to your question, that Tillich, in fact, was one of the earlier Western recipients of the Russian religious tradition. He visited Berdyaev shortly before the Second World War in Clamart. Berdyaev, I think, contributed to Tillich's journal Kairos, and even took this kind of idea of Kairos from Tillich, for whom it was a kind of central idea in his own philosophy of religion. And Tillich wrote, several enthusiastic articles about Berdyaev and about what he called the Greek Church, by which he meant the Russian Church and its potential gift. And of course, in a way, what's tying them together is a shared background in Schelling, and beyond Schelling, someone like Jakob Böhmer. And also, I mean, Schelling in particular, I think, but perhaps the German idealist tradition more generally. And so even if it's not always named, I think throughout the Russian religious philosophical tradition, there is, in a way, a constant dialogue as well with the German idealist tradition and its variations. And of course, it's one of the kind of weird twists of history that I think, for the German idealists in the early 19th century, they felt themselves occupying a space that I think some Russian writers felt they were occupying later in the century. In other words, all the innovation was coming from France in terms of rationalism and England in terms of industrialism and commercialism, and that, you know, Germany was being swamped by these new alien forces, as it were, of rationality and finance, and they had to, as it were, create a new freedom-based and affectively sensitive kind of philosophy that could respond to this and rescue, as it were, some of the threatened depths of human being. Of course, some of the ways they did that ended up being truly terrible. But yeah, so I think there's some analogies there. So I think there is a constant dialogue, explicit in many, implicit in others, perhaps ignored in others, with the German tradition as well. So the West gets a lot of stick, of course. Very often it's a stick that was fashioned in let's say, Tübingen or Berlin, and then snatched away and used in retaliation.
Yeah, and I have the sense too that the Western philosophical trends, once they reach Russia, we see about how to incarnate them. It strikes me that it's a very important part of your experience and of Randall's description of personalism, that you had that theosis, or the deification of the world, happens through the person, right? And especially between people, between persons. And that is a matter of sort of taking these thoughts, these ideas, and embodying them, right? That's the experience you make, something along the lines of your confirmation of the power of these ideas in a human being, right? Or in Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, for instance, right? It seems like that sort of is a very peculiar type of Russian theism, that is personalism, right? The deification of the world happens through people, and not necessarily limited only to individuals, but we can not only treat each other in such a way as to make the world more deified, but we can sort of cultivate ourselves in that same way so as to make ourselves more deified. And we can apply that to art, right? And music and literature. And I'm wondering if, Caryl, if you could maybe respond to this idea of how Russian religious thought sort of blew out of the literature, right? Or grew out of the literature in so many ways, especially of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. I'm wondering if, you know, there's a natural segue to my mind with parables and literary stories that create a kind of openness and yet structuredness that allows for interpretation and incites interpretation, that sort of causes you to make these parables or these analogies personal. Would you say that that's fair? How is it to your mind that literature plays such a critical role in Russian religious thought?
Well, I think it's both fair and unfair, Michael. Oh, why is it fair? When you think of Russian literature, we think of the people we love, and they're all in some way metaphysical or religious thinkers. This is Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. It's even Pushkin if you read his late poetry. It's even Turgenev if you read him at a slightly higher level than merely a social critic. It certainly is true in today's contemporary novelists. But I have to say that people who study Russian literature from the bottom up, like Jeffrey Brooks, they insist that Russia had the same sort of appetites for ugly scandal and sexual sorts of this. What's wonderful about Russian literature is that it takes that at its own value too. Dostoevsky deliberately took plots which he knew would keep people reading his novels from one installment to the next.
He had to make money.
Yeah, he had to make money,
right?
Especially
royalties.
Money. And so what he did is he picked up these plots. He knew if you put in a good parricide, murder, rape, child abuse, this was going to certainly get you an audience. And then what he does is generate out of these extraordinarily banal, criminal, really sort of boring European human disgust plots. What he does is he generates no small talk at all. Russian novels don't have any small talk. That is, even the stuff that happens around these events becomes philosophically and metaphysically very sophisticated. You got to develop a taste for it. But once you do, it's awfully hard to read these novels that basically do nothing but simply cocktail conversation. So that's Dostoevsky. Tolstoy does it in a different way. And I tried out that a bit in my entry on Tolstoy in the handbook, that he was a powerful writer who was able to do two things that it's very hard to do, I think, especially nowadays. The first is he can create a state of grace. It doesn't embarrass even a secular person, even materially. Tolstoy's states of grace are extraordinary, and I select a couple of them. If you fit into nature, as say his late hero, Haji Murat, a thoroughly violent person, fits into nature because he's wholly unambiguous about his own values and completely consistent in what he believes in and loves. You have a person like this who might belong to a different system of nature, but fits into it. This Tolstoy loves. Tolstoy also loves a sense that you are loved, that you belong. This is why he puts up with someone like Natasha Rostova and even deifies her. Pretty selfish little girl, but she's extraordinary in her instincts and in her sense that we deserve to be loved, and we have patience. We are able to learn through tragedy, but we also have to believe in our role in the world and believe that we are deificatable, to use Randall's words, that we're able to be on a path that makes us better than we are today. So Tolstoy creates characters who might themselves not have a standard sort of Kantian morality in the sense of we know what's good, we know what's bad, we all share the same categorical imperative. This is not Tolstoy's way. He himself went through major shifts, obviously, having a religious conversion and crisis in the late 1870s. And then, as you mentioned earlier, Michael, he picks up all sorts of wonderful genres that hadn't been used in a literary way before, like maxims, folk sayings. He felt music was more important as a folk song than as a symphony or as an opera. That is, he redefined all of Western culture as having fallen away from faith genres. And since he was a great writer, wasn't taken wholly as an eccentric, although God knows he took a great deal on the face for this, but he was able to imbue these genres, which were not pre-literate, but they certainly existed most vigorously in oral form. He was able to imbue them with some sort of marvelous artistic permanence, literary and verbal permanence. And that was in part because I dare to say Tolstoy belonged to that group of Russian writers that felt silence and wordlessness was probably more authentic than words. He really did believe that you could, through words, make a human being belong to the cosmos in a way that didn't require words, or that somehow catapulted above words, or pre-existed in this cosmic plenitude. This is a marvelous trait for a writer. And the Russians have always been wonderful at it. And just say a word about the 20th century, where you have these extraordinary spiritual witnesses like Solzhenitsyn, Valam Shalamov, who wouldn't call himself spiritual. He specifically wanted to be a modernist and a witness. But there is no way to read these writers and not feel that matter itself is holy. It's not necessarily sacred in the sense that it's bearing a godly quality, but it teaches you a holy or sacred truth. This is simply something that Russian literature at its best does. And if you look at most recent crop of Russian novelists, I'm thinking of Laurus by Yevgeny Vodolaskin, or Vladimir Sharov, a writer I'm extraordinarily now interested in. These are all novelists who look at Russian history as being imbued with a religious reality, which is not something that we need say is good or bad. It's simply real. It's real. Doesn't matter whether it existed in history or not, but it existed in the psyches of those who participated in it, and that Russian culture has always had an extraordinary amount of apocalyptic and eschatological thinking in it, which the West could learn from. You can also be frightened by it, of course, or bored by it, but you can learn from it. You can stand back and see larger values emerge from it. And this is, I think, a very precious and important thing if we can depoliticize it.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm at some point going. I could go on talking forever with the three of you, and we have a lot of questions from our audience. Please continue to add to them. I want to turn to them now. There's so much in this book that it would be impossible to cover everything, obviously, but you know where to find it, obviously. Let's turn to Nadezhda Kitsenko. Yuri Streiter would begin his classes in Russian theater, she says, with discussions of things like the Epiphany procession, the Peshchное действие, the three youths in the fiery furnace. Einstein showed in Ivan the Terrible Part 2, and Marina Svoboda has written about it, but not the normal weekly or daily liturgy. Would it be possible to have the participants, especially Caryl, who raised it, ponder further on which aspects of theater and liturgy might be best suited to a volume on Russian religious thought? I ask because for many girls in elite institutes taking part in church reading and singing, especially in the center of the church, not off to the side in the choir, was a key formative experience. Thank you, Mandy, for your question.
That's a terrific question. I can only answer briefly by saying that a great deal of harm has been done, I think, by taking the liturgy out of all performance, and that Russians have been marvelous at bringing it back in. Again, doesn't have to be necessarily tagged good and evil. What a liturgy does is create a communal experience where the response is as important as the performance. The performance on stage is already dialogic in the sense that an actor never fuses with his or her role, but has to constantly enact it, radiate it, animate it. And the outside is creating this larger, what we would call in Russian religious thought, sabornaya atmosphere, this saborness, this sense that you don't perform for no one. Now, Russian Orthodox thought says that you can't do anything for no one because by definition, there isn't a void. By definition, someone's looking in at you. So just the mere fact of being a human being in the world you come into has already got people in it. You can't ignore them or deny them. And likewise, I think in the theater, and this is a wonderful, I think, analogy between theater and liturgy, as you walk in, you confront an audience that both wants you to be there. In this sense, a performance is like a prayer. Somebody's listening to it already. Wants you to be there, is tuned to listening to you, and creates a dialogue. Haven't always a dialogue that needs you talking actively, but there is a dialogue of listening. And this is why, again, to go back to my problem with Benedetti's translations of Stanislavski, he does mental energy. Duchovnaya sila, it's spiritual strength. It's not mental energy. And his embarrassment was that somehow you can't use the word spiritual in Western culture because this makes people uncomfortable. And so everything becomes mental. Общение becomes communication, doesn't become communion. You know, it's not that these words mean one thing, but what you have to do is constantly think of theater as something where a live audience, even for movies, a live audience is confronting another live communicator. And these things are different because audiences change every minute, even if the actual performance has been recorded. If you don't have that sense of what animates us, we simply become rocks and trees. We simply become things that either move very slowly or don't move at all. So here I think it's wonderful what Streeter is doing in his courses, and I would love to see more active work. Elisa Ballard-Lynn at Ohio State University is now working on Stanislavski psychology and various ways of re-spiritualizing the 20th century in such a way that theater is not really pushed so far from liturgy. And I'm very looking forward to this work.
If I could just add on to what you've said, one poetic way of putting it is through Saint Seraphim of Sarov, right, whose famous expression, I acquire the spirit of peace and thousands will be saved. He doesn't say you will save thousands, right? The idea that the world is listening and watching and paying attention to what kind of being you are and how you move through that space is, I think, a deeply Russian religious ideal, right? That it's not that knowledge is a matter of becoming some kind of person and being in front of others in that way, and not so much about being convinced that belief is a matter of argumentation or a matter of getting rules exactly right, but that it's about sort of growing close in being to that which you want to understand, right? So making rocks and other dead things animated through becoming a certain kind of being, maybe. Of course, yes.
Right. Even becoming a person, I think it's relevant to note that the roots of the concept of personhood go back to Greek theater, and I think that I don't know this history as well as I should, but I think part of the idea is that the initial idea of the person as a mask, or abstracting the idea of the person from the human being. So in order to better understand the person, and then in a sense reincarnate the person back into the human being.
Excellent. Yes, this is a volume that must come to must be incarnate. Yeah, George.
Yeah, and you know, theatre is very much in the background as well. I mean, just the importance of Shakespeare for the Russians, as for the German Romantics, and this huge sort of cult of Shakespeare in the 19th century. But of course, for Dostoevsky, at least, also Schiller and Moliere, a kind of whole string of important theatrical figures. And I think, at least for Dostoevsky, that also works back into why he has been so frequently filmed in various ways, because it is so theatrical from the beginning. He sets these things up in a very theatrical, some would say too theatrical, melodramatic, even kind of vaudeville type way.
Who would say?
But that's kind of great. That's kind of great if you're a filmmaker, because you can take that and run with it. You know, half the work, turning it into a script, has already been done for you by the writer.
Excellent. I want to stick to our questions or incorporate some more ideas here. From this one from David Goldfrank, directs it to Randall. I think this is referring to your mention of Russians taking on atheism and having to formulate their arguments. In contrast to atheists, David Goldfrank asks, was the trend solid atheism, absolute denial, or more agnosticism? He wants to know.
Yeah, thank you, David, for that question. I think that, well, of course, there were both agnostic and atheistic currents, but I think that the current which was so productive for the development of Russian religious thought was hardcore atheism. And the scholar to whom we are all indebted for deepening our understanding of how hardcore atheism developed out of a more general background of doubt is Victoria Freda. Her book, Doubt, Atheism in the 19th Century Russian Intelligentsia, and then her chapter on nihilism in the Handbook. One of the virtues of both of those works is to demonstrate how thoughtful Russian atheism was, how it was a deeply sincere and authentic response to the human problems of Tsarist Russia, and how it served as a productive source for the development of Russian religious thought. So I think that it's probably not surprising in the context of Russian intellectual history that the general indifference of agnosticism became a very intense atheism in Russia. And you know, this is not surprising, again, referring to the structural situation of Russian history, where the Tsarist regime appropriated the Russian Orthodox Church for its own ideological purposes. It's not at all surprising that sensitive and sincere and humanistically oriented thinkers would react strongly against that. And one of the forms of reaction was atheism. atheism in the defense of human dignity, human values, liberation, all against the czarist absolutist state, appropriating the church, trying to appropriate the church for its own purposes.
Great. I'll go. Let's go to Alexander Smith's question. She says, "Thank you very much to the editors for producing such an important volume. I'm just wondering whether you had considered including Russian emigre writer, artist, and thinker Maria Skoptsova, Mать Maria. If not, would you consider her as a Russian religious philosopher or not? I know that Paul Valliere touches on this topic in his sort of a summative article at the end of the work, where he speaks about the potential, right, for feminist theology to be rooted in Russian religious thinkers like Maria Skoptsova and Elizabeth Blair Siegel. But what would you, to answer your question, would you consider her a Russian religious philosopher or not?
I think, sorry, I mean, I think I was going to initially say in response to Randall's first introduction that if I would fault our volume, it's for one or two omissions. I think Caryl has flagged up theatre, and I think, you know, Mother Maria Skoptsova is probably another omission who should have had more space given. Probably we should have had something about Merezhkovsky or him and his circle as well, because even if such characters aren't always necessarily attractive, they're very significant in their time and provocative and remain provocative, which is kind of interesting. So there are probably a few gaps, and possibly also something more thematically addressing either the role or the representation of women in Russian religious thought, because again, I mean, for Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, the woman question, as they called it in the 19th century, is a really big part of their agenda and of the cultural debate. So that's probably a gap that if there's to be a second edition, we might have to talk about.
Yes, I think
we're recording this, so take notes.
I think, but Sasha, just to answer your question, there's been a lot of, I think, wonderful bits of research done on women figures, not just female holy fools, and that's not foolish at all. But Rowan Williams' most recent book, Looking East in Winter, ends on Maria Skoptsova and what it is that makes this sort of testimony possible, the very recent translation of her actual theological writings. We're dealing with a Simone Weil sort of character here who had an extraordinarily active life and also one that wrote enormously, but all that was not collated until after her own time on earth. So it's a very interesting sort of sanctity, and women have played a huge role in it. We made a number of excisions. We also didn't say sectarians on Russian ground. You know, this is tricky. And you start looking at a culture which is, in my view, theological and spiritual through and through. It's awfully difficult to make a decision on where to cut things off. But it is true that women are perhaps given less voice than they could have had. But that research is also on its way.
Yeah, one place to go for Mother Maria in particular is Natasha Yermolayeva's dissertation on her, which is a fantastic resource along those lines. So here's to hoping that more of that is on the way. It seems like we're primed for it with all of the brilliant scholars that are devoted to this topic. Let's see. We have from Paul Ward something that I'm also interested in. Thanks for the discussion. He says, could you say a bit more about the intended audience for the volume, and especially how students, for example, might use the volume to get a handle on these issues? How do you see it? How to make it most useful? What would you suggest? Yeah.
The OUP script for these handbooks is that, you know, your target audience is a postgraduate audience. It's not primarily an undergraduate audience, so it's for people who've got a certain amount of background. So it might be a student working in theology who comes across, I don't know, Bakhtin or Tolstoy, but doesn't know where to look. And this is, as it were, a first step, or the other way around, of course, someone who's working in literature and comes across a Russian philosophical figure and says, Frank, who's he? Never heard of him. So it's in a sense for people who are not specialists, but who have the aptitude and certain context for getting in at a reasonably advanced level. No one expects it's going to be given to first-year undergraduates unless they come with exceptionally well-defined interest in the area. That would be, as it were, my sort of publisher's response, as it were, but perhaps that needs further nuance. I don't really know, say, what its role would be in the world of Russianists.
Yeah.
Would be a different one, I guess, from the sort of theologians and philosophers I might have in mind.
I'll tell you that in my upcoming apocalypse course, I'll be sort of plucking from individual articles to have background for thinkers like Bulgakov, Solovyov, and Florensky, and specifically their eschatological worldview. And the index is super useful in a massive work like this to just sort of isolate moments to sort of carry you around the book, around topics that interest you. Just two thoughts to add, right? Any other thoughts to add to that, Caryl or Randall?
Well, I would just very briefly, I think the target audience of the purpose of the Oxford Handbook series as a whole is that the handbooks are to be regarded as at least this is the aspiration, the point of first reference for anyone interested in the subject matter. And they're not the entries, the chapters in some respects serve as encyclopedia articles, but in other respects, perhaps more prominently, they're statements of the state of the field on the particular topic covered in an entry. And I think that that our handbook succeeded admirably in meeting that purpose of the Oxford Handbook series.
Yeah,
it's successful, all right.
I can only add to what Randall said that handbooks are very handy nowadays. It seems to be doing them in a huge number of genres. Brief glimpses, a very short introduction. These are all bestsellers. And I think it creates real problem. Either you select a single famous person to do a very brief introduction, and then the entire worldview is encapsulated by this one very important personage who's writing and looking back from her or his perspective. That's one way to do it. What we tried to do was to get people who were either rising scholars, this is important, rising people who aren't burdened by too much of the past, but who know it because that's their job to know it. Get them to write entries, and then have a couple of old folks there sort of capping it from the top, but put reasonably known and rising people together, lots of different names within a single book. And so you can't say it has one integrated point of view. And the fact that we often have more than one entry on a single person is also, I think, pretty interesting and important. But yes, it's never going to be valid or updated beyond its publication date. That's the way these things go.
And these things are always contestable. Of course, the decisions, what we were saying before about the role of women and the representation of women. Our readers' reports, I think one report said, why have you bothered having anything about Berdyaev? And then some kind of comment along the lines of what Bart said about, it's all very muddled and confused. And the other reader said, it's excellent that you've got 2 articles on Berdyaev because this reflects his stature in the whole, I mean, I think so many of the people we deal with are very provocative and strong intellectual personalities that they provoke quite strong reactions, negative as well as possible. And a lot of the stuff's still up in the air. There isn't a settled view, as it were, and there may not be for some time. That's good. I mean, that there isn't a settled view.
Yeah, that's totally true, George. And in fact, the person we asked to do the last entry, which is Igor Yevlampiev, and he was very good about this. It's almost a review of the volume. He said, well, now could have gone this direction. I sort of like this article. This one really overlooked a very important point, and see my work on this if you disagree or agree. This is terrific to be able to incorporate your own review, which is partly criticism at the end of your own book. This tends to sort of lessen the cutting edge of datedness. if you can have your own book dated by a person who's contributed to it. So I think that's the purpose of something like this, to show the questions as well as the answers that have come out.
It's generative, absolutely.
We were extremely fortunate to have the three assessments conclude the volume by eminent authorities from America, Great Britain, and Russia: Paul Valliere, Rowan Williams, and Igor Yevlampiev.
There's so much good content in here. We could have broken up our book talk into parts, right? Easily, or even into individual articles. We're taking a bit more time than usual since there are three excellent speakers and instead of two or one. I would like to just have one more question for the audience, and then we'll wrap it up. So this one comes from someone whose name is listed as Otto. Thank you, Randall. I'd like to discuss the implications of centering Russian religious thought in humanism and idealism for our understanding of Dostoevsky. Here's another way to approach the question. Barth despised Christian humanism, or A, Barth despised Christian humanism. B, Barth found religious truth in Dostoevsky. C, how does this affect how we understand Dostoevsky's place within Russian religious thought?
Well, I thank you for the question, but I wonder if, George, I'm happy to take a stab at it, but I'm also happy to defer to you if you'd like. Either way is fine with me.
I've probably read more Barth than is good for me. Yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing with Barth. You know, the work that established his reputation was the second edition of his commentary on the Roman letter to the Romans, published in the immediate aftermath of World War I, and seemingly offering a pretty blanket condemnation of the whole development of Western society up until the catastrophe of the First World War. And his work on it coincided with the publication of Dostoevsky in German. And I think he, at that time, used Dostoevsky in a way that was very colored by the whole German reception, not just of Dostoevsky, but of Russia in general, for whom Dostoevsky often served, as it were, as the epitome, the essential voice of Russia. And if you look through the commentary on Romans, Barth again and again refers to Russian man, who is man outside the law. Basically, he's a kind of wild animal. He's man who has not been tamed by bourgeois society, who is not governed by reason, let alone rational economic self-interest. He's an extremist. He can flip from being a mystic to a terrorist. I think they all then take very seriously this idea that Alyosha Karamazov is going to become a terrorist, and that he's a mystic, which the narrator denies, and that he's going to become a terrorist, which we don't know. You know, you get this in George Lukács as well, that the mystic and the terrorist are just two sides of the Russian soul, if you like. And in 1919, 1921, I think Barth is buying into this. His colleague, the other Protestant theologian, Edward Tornison, writes a little book on Dostoevsky, which is kind of all along those lines. You know, this is man without the mask, as it were, of bourgeois humanism. But so, and I mean, I think Barth's pretty wrong about all of that. I mean, it goes along with the view of Dostoevsky that was propagated by Georg Brandes, who did a lot to kind of stamp the image of Dostoevsky in the West, that he had no discipline of writing. He just wrote, you know, kind of without planning it. It all poured out. He was probably guilty of at least half the crimes he wrote about, and that he was, you know, a kind of pretty crazy guy altogether. So I think, you know, at that point, at least, that's kind of what Barth likes about Dostoevsky. So he's not seeing Dostoevsky in the way that I think Randall and I perhaps argued to see him, that he's someone who is actually offering a very careful and very thought through and very analytical account of the human person, leading to the requirement of the human person for God. So I think Barth is just kind of getting him wrong.
Yeah.
there. I mean, you know, it's a misreading. Misreadings can be very exciting and very useful. They can kind of get things going. And I think at a certain point, this quite inspired me too, you know. It's a strong misreading, but I think it is a misreading. And that Dostoevsky is indeed much more humanist than Barth could at that point have seen. And if he had seen him as a humanist, he wouldn't have been so keen.
At any rate, Barth identifies only one of Dostoevsky's voices. You know, Dostoevsky, the writer, there are many voices. Dostoevsky, in his works, there are an infinite number of voices. So it would be a very difficult, even impossible task to identify the real Dostoevsky. The impossibility or difficulty of doing so is what makes him such a great writer and thinker and cultural figure. Just one note: it's important to recall that around that time, 1880, there was a real constellation of remarkable cultural forces that served to catalyze or crystallize the development of Russian religious thought. The brothers Karamazov, of course, Boris Chicherin's work, Science and Religion, Vladimir Solovyov's lectures on godmanhood, Tolstoy's A Confession. So Dostoevsky was a central figure in that constellation around 1880, the crucible from which the remarkable Russian religious renaissance followed.
And if I could just add one last word here after Randall, and it was said by Chekhov of Tolstoy, but I think it could also be said of Dostoevsky that the task of a genuinely immortal writer, the best writers, are to pose the questions, not to answer them. And this, again, is something which appeals to secularists and spiritually attuned people. It really doesn't matter. Russian literature, Russian art asks the right questions. And that, I think, is the sort of larger task our handbook tried to do, ask the right questions.
Well, I've just discovered through the chat that I thought it was an especially sharp question for a wanderer who had come into our room, but it's Susan McReynolds who had that last question. She also had one very quick response. I agree that Barth is off the mark about Dostoevsky, but would we really assimilate Dostoevsky to humanism? Since it's a continuation, I'll allow it. Any responses to that?
I will in a moment, but something funny's happened with my screen. So
okay.
No, I myself would not identify in any kind of monochromatic way Dostoevsky as a humanist. It's much more complicated than that. I mean, Dostoevsky certainly, as Caryl was saying, poses the right questions, enabling us to think about what it is to be human, what it is to be a person, what are the metaphysical implications of human nature and personhood. But I think Dostoevsky is just too complicated, and his work is too complicated to monochromatically identify him as a humanist. And I mean, none of the three of us would say that.
No, but I think in Barth's terms, I think for him, humanism isn't just, as it were, a certain tradition stemming from the Renaissance and running on through various subsequent incarnations and coming out, let's say, with people like Berdyaev or Jacques Maritain, as well in the West. But I mean, for Barth, I think humanism, as well as that technical meaning, means a theological approach that starts with the human being.
Right.
And that is what he is vigorously opposing, in a sense, just about the whole way through his theological career. And I think in that sense, Dostoevsky is humanist, in that he begins, as Barth would put it, with man. I mean, Barth would say that's a theologically flawed first move, but I do think that's where Dostoevsky begins. So in those narrow terms, I think one would say Dostoevsky is humanist.
Yeah, the posing of the anthropological problem for religion, or the anthropological foundation of religion.
And where I disagree with Bart is he would say, and if you start there, you'll never get to God. I think I would want to argue that actually, given that we are human beings, there isn't any other way for us to get there.
I wholeheartedly agree with that.
As good a place to pause as any, but I hope that this is truly a pause and that our conversation continues. Lisa Holzberg, I see your question. I've copied it. I'll send it to our panelists. Hopefully they'll be willing to say a word in response afterwards. I just wanted to quickly bring everyone's attention to the continuation of the Russia question. We're going to have as our guests Randall Poole and Paul Valliere, and the title, to get it exact, Randall, is
Law and the Christian Tradition in Modern Russia. It's already been published. It is available both in print and as an ebook. And again, Michael, thank you very much for your interest in hosting a webinar devoted to that book as well.
Well, thank you for editing such great and interesting works. And I'm in contact with Hannah Stahl. Thank you to Scott Kenworthy for connecting with her. We'll also be discussing, my hope is, Russian Church in the Digital Era, Mediatization of Orthodoxy. Stay tuned about the specific scheduling. Those are just two. We'll have two more afterwards. It has been such a delight to have you visit the Russia question and to have this conversation with all three of you. Randall, I'll see you in New Orleans before long. I don't know if anyone else is going to be there, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you to our audience for your excellent questions. And I hope that you'll return in the spring for more.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you very much.